When the relationship ended, people kept telling me the same thing. You'll move on. You'll love again. Time heals. But what terrified me was that it didn't feel like I had only lost someone. It felt like I had lost myself. The routines were gone. The future I imagined was gone. The version of me that existed inside that life was gone. Even simple things started feeling unfamiliar. I didn't know what I liked anymore, what I wanted anymore, who I was without that relationship organizing my emotional world. And that's when I realized something devastating. Sometimes a breakup doesn't only break your heart. Sometimes it destroys your internal map too. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something honestly. Have you ever gone through a breakup that felt bigger than heartbreak? A breakup that didn't only leave you grieving the person, but grieving yourself? Have you ever looked at your life after a relationship ended and realized you no longer recognized who you were outside of it? If you've ever felt that kind of collapse, I really want you to tell me in the comments. And while you're there, tell me where you're watching from, because one of the loneliest parts of identity loss after a relationship is how difficult it is to explain to other people. Everyone expects heartbreak, but not everyone understands what it feels like when the end of a relationship also dismantles your routines, your future plans, your emotional structure, your sense of direction, and the identity you quietly built around loving someone. Stay with me until the end of this episode because today we're talking about a kind of breakup that goes far beyond missing someone. We're talking about relational identity collapse. About what happens when a relationship becomes so psychologically central that when it ends, the person no longer knows how to emotionally organize themselves without it. We're also going to talk about how cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, helps explain why some breakups feel psychologically disorienting at the level of identity, why people lose their sense of self after emotionally consuming relationships, and how healing becomes possible when someone slowly rebuilds their internal world from the ground up instead of only trying to get over another person. Because sometimes you do not lose only the relationship. Sometimes you lose the version of yourself that existed inside it too. One of the most psychologically destabilizing experiences a person can go through is the end of a relationship that had quietly become part of their identity. Not just part of their life, part of their internal structure. This is why some breakups feel much larger than heartbreak itself. The pain is not only emotional attachment to another person. The pain is disorientation, psychological collapse, identity confusion. The terrifying feeling of no longer knowing who you are outside the relationship that once organized your world emotionally. And this experience is much more common than people realize. Because relationships do not only create connection. Over time, they also shape routines, emotional regulation, future expectations, self-image, daily structure, and personal identity. The longer and more emotionally consuming the relationship becomes, the more psychologically integrated it often becomes into the person's sense of self. This is especially true in relationships involving emotional dependency, over-accommodation, chronic self-abandonment, or dynamics where one person slowly organizes their entire emotional life around the relationship. That's why after certain breakups, people don't only think, "I miss them." They think, "I don't know how to exist anymore." And that feeling can become terrifying. Simple decisions suddenly feel exhausting. Familiar routines feel empty. The future feels psychologically blank. Even identity itself starts feeling unstable. The person may realize they no longer know what they genuinely enjoy, what they want independently, what parts of themselves were authentic, what parts were adaptation, who they are outside the relationship. This is where cognitive behavioral therapy becomes incredibly important. CBT helps explain how identity becomes cognitively fused with relationships over time. Through repeated thoughts, behaviors, emotional patterns, routines, and beliefs, the relationship slowly becomes part of the brain's internal organization system. The person begins unconsciously building thoughts like, "My life makes sense with them. My future exists with them. I know who I am in this relationship. This relationship gives structure to my identity. Without this relationship, I don't know who I am." And once those beliefs become deeply integrated, the breakup does not only trigger grief. It triggers identity destabilization. The nervous system suddenly loses one of its main organizing structures. That's why people in this state often describe feeling psychologically fragmented, emotionally unreal, disconnected from themselves, numb one moment, and devastated the next. And one of the hardest parts is that many people judge themselves harshly for this experience. They think, why can't I just move on? Why does this feel like psychological collapse? Why do I feel empty instead of simply sad? But sometimes the relationship was never only romantic attachment. Sometimes it became the emotional architecture holding the person's identity together. Today I want to talk about that collapse. The grief of losing not only love, but your internal orientation. The terrifying feeling of no longer recognizing yourself after a relationship ends. And how CBT helps people slowly rebuild identity, emotional grounding, self-definition, and psychological stability after relationships that became too central to their sense of self. When Ava's marriage ended, people assumed her biggest pain would be loneliness. It wasn't. Loneliness was part of it, yes. But what truly terrified her was something much deeper. She no longer recognized herself outside the relationship. For 12 years, her life had been organized around the marriage. Her routines, emotional energy, future plans, social identity, daily structure, priorities, even her sense of purpose had slowly intertwined with being his partner. At first, she didn't notice how much of herself had merged into the relationship. Most people don't. Identity erosion usually happens gradually. Small compromises, small adaptations, small reorganizations, small emotional sacrifices. Over time, Ava stopped asking herself questions like, what do I want? What excites me? What feels meaningful to me independently? The relationship became the answer to those questions automatically. And because the marriage lasted so long, her brain eventually stopped separating her identity from their life. That's why the breakup felt psychologically catastrophic. The day he left, Ava didn't only lose a partner. She lost routines, future assumptions, emotional predictability, identity structure, and the psychological role she had inhabited for over a decade. Suddenly, everything felt emotionally unfamiliar. The house felt strange. The silence felt violent. Weekends felt unbearable. Her own life felt emotionally disconnected from her. Even basic decisions exhausted her because internally, she no longer trusted her own orientation. This is something CBT explains extremely well. Human identity is reinforced through repeated cognitive and behavioral patterns. The longer someone repeatedly thinks, behaves, and emotionally organizes themselves around a relationship, the more the brain starts encoding that relationship as part of the self-concept. So when the relationship disappears, the brain experiences more than heartbreak. It experiences structural disruption. That's why Ava kept thinking, I don't know who I am anymore. Not metaphorically, psychologically. She realized she had spent years adapting herself around the relationship so consistently that she no longer knew which parts of her still existed independently from it. And this created profound emotional panic, because now she wasn't only grieving him, she was grieving herself. The version of herself that existed as a wife. The version of herself that believed in that future. The routines that gave shape to her days. The identity she had emotionally invested in for years. And without that structure, everything inside her felt psychologically unanchored. That kind of collapse is incredibly hard to explain to people who have never experienced it. Because from the outside, others often think, it's just a breakup. You'll move on. You'll meet someone else. But internally, the person feels like their entire emotional reality has been dismantled. And that's a completely different kind of grief. One of the most important things CBT teaches is that identity is not fixed. It is continuously reinforced through thoughts, behaviors, routines, emotional patterns, and repeated self-perception. That means relationships can slowly become psychologically fused with identity without the person consciously realizing it. That's exactly what happened to Ava. Over the years, she had unconsciously built beliefs like, my life makes sense inside this marriage. My future exists here. This relationship defines stability. I know who I am when I'm needed by him. Those beliefs became deeply integrated into her emotional structure. So, after the breakup, Her brain did not simply experience loss. It experienced disorganization. This is why people in identity collapse after relationships often feel mentally foggy, emotionally directionless, detached from themselves, exhausted by simple choices, disconnected from meaning, strangely unreal. The brain is trying to reorganize itself without a structure it became dependent on psychologically. And this often creates another painful cognitive distortion. If I feel this lost without the relationship, maybe I was nothing without it. That belief becomes extremely dangerous, because now the breakup starts feeling like evidence of personal emptiness instead of evidence of emotional overdependence on an external structure. CBT helps challenge this distortion directly. Ava's therapist helped her notice something important. She had not lost her identity permanently. She had lost contact with it. That distinction changed everything, because identity was not truly gone. It had simply become buried underneath years of adaptation, emotional fusion, self-abandonment, and relational dependency. And once Ava understood that, healing stopped being, "How do I get my old life back?" Healing became, "How do I slowly rebuild a relationship with myself?" That question completely changed the direction of her recovery. Instead of obsessively replaying the marriage, she slowly began rebuilding internal structure. Routinist preferences, independent choices, emotional regulation, self-definition, personal goals, identity, outside romantic attachment. CBT helped her observe automatic thoughts like, "My life has no meaning now. I don't know who I am. I'll never feel whole again." And instead of automatically believing those thoughts, she learned to examine them. Was her identity truly gone? Or was her nervous system temporarily disorganized after years of emotional fusion? That distinction created hope, because if identity was destroyed permanently, healing would feel impossible. But if identity had simply become underdeveloped outside the relationship, then rebuilding became psychologically possible. And slowly, Ava started discovering something surprising. Underneath the grief, parts of her still existed. Not fully developed yet, not emotionally stable yet, but still there, waiting. The hardest part of rebuilding identity after a relationship ends is tolerating the emptiness long enough to rediscover yourself without rushing to fill the void immediately. That emptiness terrifies people, especially because after identity-fused relationships, silence often feels psychologically threatening. The person suddenly faces themselves without the structure that previously organized their emotional world. Ava struggled with this deeply. At first, she wanted immediate relief. Immediate certainty, immediate replacement for the collapse. But CBT helped her understand something incredibly important. Disorientation after identity loss is not proof of permanent brokenness. It is a transition state. Her nervous system was learning how to emotionally organize life without the relationship acting as its central anchor. That process felt painfully unfamiliar. Some mornings, Ava woke up and genuinely did not know what to do with herself emotionally. The future felt blank. Her motivation disappeared. Even activities she used to enjoy felt disconnected from her. And this is where many people panic and make the relationship even more psychologically sacred in retrospect. They think, "See? Life only made sense with them." But CBT helped Ava challenge that conclusion. The relationship had not created her identity from nothing. It had simply become the primary structure organizing it. That meant rebuilding was possible. Slowly, Ava began practicing something incredibly difficult, making choices based on herself again. Tiny choices at first. What she liked, what she wanted, what she valued, what felt meaningful independently. At first, these choices felt strangely empty because her nervous system was still conditioned around relational identity instead of personal identity. But repetition matters psychologically. Every independent behavior slowly rebuilt cognitive structure. Every boundary rebuilt self-definition. Every personal decision rebuilt internal orientation. Every moment of self-trust rebuilt psychological grounding. And, gradually, something beautiful started happening. Ava stopped experiencing herself only as someone who had been left. She started experiencing herself as someone becoming visible to herself again. That shift changed everything. Because the goal was no longer, "How do I return to who I was before?" The goal became, who am I becoming now that I am finally forced to meet myself outside that relationship? That question transformed grief into reconstruction. Not instantly, not perfectly, but enough for healing to slowly become possible. And this is something people rarely talk about honestly. Sometimes the breakup itself does not destroy identity completely. Sometimes it exposes how much identity had already been surrendered long before the relationship ended. That realization is painful, but it can also become the beginning of the most authentic rebuilding process of someone's life. So let me end this episode with something I think many people desperately need to hear after identity-shattering breakups. You did not only lose someone, you lost the emotional structure your nervous system had been organizing itself around for years. That is why this feels bigger than heartbreak. That is why the grief feels existential. Why the future feels blank. Why simple decisions feel exhausting. Why you no longer recognize yourself. You are not dramatic. You are not weak. You are not failing at moving on. Your internal world is reorganizing itself after emotional fusion. And yes, that process can feel terrifying. But CBT teaches something incredibly hopeful. Identity is not something you either permanently have or permanently lose. Identity can be rebuilt. Slowly, intentionally, repeatedly, through new thoughts, new behaviors, new routines, new choices, new experiences of self-trust. Ava did not heal by immediately becoming confident again. She healed by slowly reconnecting with herself, one small decision at a time. One routine, one boundary, one honest realization, one independent choice. And eventually, she understood something life-changing. The relationship ending did not mean she was empty. It meant she had spent so long organizing herself around someone else that she had forgotten how to emotionally belong to herself. That realization hurt deeply. But it also became freedom. Because once she stopped trying to recover the relationship as a way of recovering herself, she finally started rebuilding something much more important. An identity that could exist independently from being loved by someone else. And that is one of the most powerful forms of healing a person can experience. Now I really want to hear from you. Have you ever gone through a breakup that felt like more than heartbreak? Did you ever feel like the relationship ended and took your sense of self with it? What was the hardest part? The loneliness, the identity confusion, the emotional disorientation, the loss of future, or the feeling that you no longer recognized yourself outside the relationship? Tell me your story in the comments, because so many people are silently experiencing identity collapse after relationships while believing they are simply not strong enough to move on. And if this episode spoke to you, like the video, share it with someone who needs this conversation, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode. Because sometimes healing does not begin when you stop loving the other person. Sometimes healing begins when you slowly start rebuilding your relationship with yourself.